Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining our session on antimicrobial resistance in the food and agriculture sector. This session is part of a collaboration between VBDO and World Animal Protection. My name is Sarah Heinsbroek. I'm a project manager at VBDO, the Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development, and I will be your host today. Next slide, please. So first, a couple practical notes. This session is being recorded and it will be made available for viewing online. So please feel free to turn off your camera or leave it on according to your preference. If you have any questions during the presentations, please post it in a chat box and I'll make sure to include it in the Q&A, which will be held at the end of this session. During the Q&A, you can post questions in the chat box as well, or you can raise your digital hand, and you can do this by clicking the hand emoticon on the bottom of your screen, and then I will have someone unmute you and you can ask your question. As you can see, we have an amazing speaker lineup and a very busy program. So let's dive right in. Anthony, please, if you could do the honors.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for this opportunity to speak to you all. If we could move my first slide, just thank you for the opportunity to offer some context as to why investors should be concerned about antimicrobial resistance, particularly in the food system. Next slide. Antimicrobials are a cornerstone of medicine today, and we all know of their use firsthand, treating infections we or our families have encountered. When we talk about antimicrobials, we are particularly concerned about antibiotics, the drugs that fight bacterial infections, those that treat viral infections like HIV/AIDS or COVID-19, or even fungal infections are also important. Together, they are life-saving and make possible the miracles of modern-day medicine, from chemotherapy and organ donor transplants to enabling patients to survive bloodstream infections and bacterial pneumonia. But it is the pipeline to bring novel antibiotics to market that is the one that has faltered in recent decades. The economics of treating bacterial infections are at odds with the biology of drug resistance. Unlike other medicines, the more we sell, the more we use these drugs, the greater the risk that the microbes they treat will become resistant. And this global health challenge continues to grow. With over 1.2 million deaths attributable to bacterial AMR, or antimicrobial resistance alone, it takes more lives than HIV/AIDS or malaria each year, as seen in the bar graph on the right of this slide. This burden disproportionately falls on those in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than half of those who died due to AMR were children under 5. But this is not a problem limited to low and middle-income countries. Far from it. In Europe, there are over 670,000 cases of antibiotic-resistant infections and over 33,000 deaths a year. Of note, a recent EU report notes that resistance to commonly used antibiotics in bacteria from food-producing animals remains high, 20, 50, or even 70%. And in the United States, more than 2.8 million antibiotic-resistant infections and more than 35,000 people die each year. Next slide. Importantly, the continued effectiveness of antibiotics and antimicrobials depends on how they are used, not only in human medicine, but in food production. Nearly 3/4 of antimicrobials sold globally are intended for use in food animal production, as opposed to human medicine. And as the map on the left illustrates, a handful of countries represented by the largest bubbles are responsible for a disproportionate share of this consumption. Many of the same classes of antibiotics used in human medicine are used in food, animal, and crop production. So the drug resistance that develops from their application in the food system can cross over to their use in human medicine. Effective antibiotics also play an important role in ensuring agricultural livelihoods, both in maintaining the health, but also the productivity from food animal production. But their use in food production has not been carefully applied. The World Organization for Animal Health notes that a quarter of countries reported use of antimicrobials for growth promotion. By that, we mean that antibiotics were not used to treat disease in animals, but instead to improve growth of animals, improving feed efficiency, to offset poor hygienic conditions, or to fatten animals faster. And for all classes of medically important antimicrobials, the WHO guidelines in 2017 called for reducing their overall use in food animal production, not using them at all for growth promotion, and even not to use them for prevention when there has been no diagnosis of disease. On the next slide. So we might wonder, how do drug-resistant infections in the food system show up in human medicine? 600 million cases of foodborne diseases each year, and 420,000 deaths resulting. This is a WHO statistic to which many of us can relate. While some of these are bacterial, both bacterial and viral presentations of foodborne illness may prompt overuse of antibiotics. There has been a growing appreciation of drug-resistant foodborne outbreaks around the world, from the 10,000 afflicted with extensively drug-resistant typhoid in Pakistan to a recent survey of pork sample from UK supermarkets that found 10% carried vancomycin-resistant enterococci, a superbug found in wound and urinary tract infections. Those who argue that it's just a matter of cooking food right should tell that to the 600 million patients who came down with foodborne diseases. Of note, though, is not just diarrheal and gastrointestinal diseases. A few years back, a research study found that urinary tract infections also could be traced directly to a drug-resistant form of E. coli in retail poultry meat, chicken off your grocery shelves. And resistance to one of our last-line antibiotics in human medicine, colistin, emerged in China, where this genetic determinant of drug resistance was found in food animals, raw meat, and patients hospitalized with diagnosed infection. The antibiotic was seldom used in human medicine, but too often in food animal production at that time. Next slide. Across the food value chain, there are opportunities to reduce the use of antimicrobials. Civil society groups, like the members of our Antibiotic Resistance Coalition, have worked to influence food procurement so that those buying for restaurant chains or grocery stores would do so responsibly and insist on that food animal products be raised without the routine use of antibiotics. Beginning in 2015, a group of US-based NGOs issued the Chain Reaction Report, calling initially on the top 25 restaurant food chains in the country to do just that for poultry. And over the first 3 years, this consumer report card prompted first 5, then 9, and then 14 of these top restaurant chains, accounting for 2/3 of all fast food industry revenue in the country, to take steps to limit antibiotics in their supply chain. And this had ripple effects upstream on the Tyson and Purdue's in the poultry industry, but pork and beef have lagged behind. The Center for Science and Environment in India would put out its double standards report, flagging that the timetable for removing antibiotics from the supply chains of these multinational franchises in the United States did not extend the same to India. And in the United Kingdom, the Alliance to Save Our Antibiotics put out a consumer report card on UK grocery store chains and how they were managing these practices in their own branded products and those stocked up from other producers. And there are many other examples, from testing of retail food products for antibiotic residues to drug-resistant microbes, that have helped to raise consumer awareness in these public-facing brands and sometimes greater accountability through their food procurement practices. Food suppliers, too, are responding to growing consumer demand for healthier, safer foods, from organic certification to even a number of Ecuadorian shrimp fisheries banding together under the Sustainable Shrimp Fisheries Partnership and adhering to standards to use no antibiotics. On the next slide, these demand-side approaches undertaken by members of the Antibiotic Resistance Coalition and others represent the use of market signals across the food value chain to register and reward practices less reliant on antibiotic use. We've been working with the FAO this year, the Food and Agriculture Organization, to encourage taking up this approach as part of the emerging plans for a global campaign to reduce the need to use antimicrobials. It's critical that antimicrobial use data or antimicrobial resistance data be publicly transparent so that countries and companies alike might be held accountable for their actions or inaction, as the case might be. As part of this project between UN, FAO, and React Action on Antibiotic Resistance, we are looking for examples from consumer scorecards to food producer certification to shine a light where data transparency does exist and how it has been used to motivate policy efforts to reduce the use of antimicrobials. And we hope that this will support FAO's efforts to launch a new platform for country-level reporting called INFARM and its efforts to reduce the need to use antimicrobials. On the next slide. Now, AMR also may connect to the investor community in another way, climate change. As climate change worsens, infectious diseases will be on the rise and migrate to new geographies, along with greater antibiotic use. Pressure on food production systems will mount too, increasing reliance on antimicrobials. But might antimicrobials contribute to climate change? Well, we may not have definitive science to back this yet, but a study in 2016 looked at the effect of a 3-day course of tetracycline, an antibiotic used in human medicine, to treat cattle, and found that it increased methane gas emissions from the manure. Treated cattle produce 1.8 times more methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Now, why might this be important? It turns out that livestock emissions account for nearly a third of human-caused methane emissions. So if treating livestock with antibiotics contributes to anywhere close to 1.8 times more methane gas emissions, figuring this out could be a game changer. Should we be looking for these causal linkages that might place the use of antimicrobials much closer to the front of the line in the fight to slow climate change? On the next slide, up to 80% of the antimicrobials consumed, though, by humans or animals may enter into the waste stream. The emerging scientific literature raises intriguing findings from studies that suggest that AMR in the food system connects with these environmental concerns. Herbicides like glyphosate or Roundup, 2,4-D, and dicamba can affect the tolerance to antibiotics. While it can go in either direction, worrisomely, it can induce greater drug resistance in enteric bacteria like E. coli. Taking these findings from lab to field studies, another study found several herbicides promoted the movement of antibiotic resistance genes between bacteria, and this pattern of herbicide exposure and increased antibiotic resistance genes was found in agricultural soils taken across 11 provinces in China. Now, AMR also intersects with another major environmental pollutant. Microplastics are nearly ubiquitous, it would seem, in our environment. And as recent studies from VUA in the Netherlands confirm, microplastics have been found in 3/4 of meat and milk products tested, and even the blood of farm animals. What has not been as widely reported, though, is that microplastics form biofilms on their surface that can increase by 100-fold the uptake of genetic exchange of drug-resistant determinants. In both examples, the science is still early stage, but reinforce the need for the environmental dimensions of AMR to be considered. And we were delighted that the UN Environment Program joined the now quadripartite agencies working jointly on AMR earlier this year. On the next slide. Now, despite these findings, that AMR in our food system and the environment, global health financing to tackle this challenge has not followed. So why? With this increased policymaker awareness of emerging infectious diseases like COVID-19, have we spent trillions of dollars responding to the pandemic, while the multi-partner trust fund on AMR, after over 3 years of operation, has only raised just monies in the ballpark of $26 million? Honestly, I cannot think of a good reason. Even before the pandemic, the World Bank projected that if AMR goes unchecked, up to 24 million more people could be forced into extreme poverty by 2030. It looks like COVID-19 might have beaten AMR to the punch here. But under the high-impact AMR scenario, this could amount to a 3.8% loss of annual GDP by 2050, with an annual shortfall of $3.4 trillion by 2030. The bank had concluded that putting resources into AMR containment now is one of the highest yield investments countries can make. By investing just $9 billion a year in low and middle income countries, we could avert trillions of dollars of potential economic losses. And significant returns on this investment would accrue to low and middle income countries, but over 80% of these returns, as illustrated on the pie chart on the right, would benefit upper middle and high income countries, the very countries that would be best positioned to make this global investment. Next slide. In high-income countries, too, AMR containment would be cost-effective. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, comprised largely of high-income countries, put out a report that shows how AMR containment measures could be cost-effective. AMR-related complications across 33 OECD and EU countries could cost up to $3.5 billion each year between 2015 and 2050, much of it from longer hospital stays. In OECD countries, a comprehensive intervention package that addresses AMR both in hospitals and clinics, as well as communities, could come to just $2 per capita per a year. Such an investment would avert 47,000 deaths a year in OECD countries, and the public health package could pay for itself in under a year and save $4.8 billion a year in OECD countries. And on the final slide, we could really use the help of your community to tackle AMR. In the food sector, we have seen in recent years a promising start in the right direction, but much remains to be done. Investors are particularly well positioned to work with consumer groups and civil society organizations to generate market signals for food buyers to procure products raised without the routine use of antimicrobials, incentivize food producers to adopt practices less reliant on antimicrobial usage, and to share data, information, and intelligence to help us identify strategic opportunities to reshape the food value chain. You could talk just to companies and their shareholders, but we need more to create the enabling conditions for transformative system change. We have so much to learn from your sector. We need monitoring, transparent data, accountability. Smallholder farmers may need support in making the transition, insurance programs that help de-risk making such changes, and technical assistance for doing so. We need the market intelligence to shape public campaigns and to target strategically the key points in the food value chain where the greatest leverage difference might be made. And this may well require governments backing such changes so that transforming our food system can also be done equitably. Thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections with you today.
Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, very interesting to see how AMR is linked to other issues as well, such as microplastics and perhaps even climate change. Yeah, so just a reminder, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box and we'll get to them during the Q&A. Teni, if you could please share your views.
Yes, thank you very much. If we go to the next slide, please. And thank you, Anthony. That was really interesting. And one thing that I really enjoyed hearing or really resonated with me is in terms of that transparency and how important it is. And so I look forward to the work that you're doing with the FAO. Also wanting to bring out a little bit about how, as Anthony was talking about investors and the work that they can do, how it is within FAIRR that we're trying to really galvanize and coordinate that somewhat. So thank you to the audience for joining us as we discuss AMR and the challenge it presents today. I'm Teni, speaking from the FAIRR initiative, and we'll be spending a bit of time talking about why AMR is a key business risk for investors, as well as sharing our experience when it comes to taking collective investor action on AMR. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to introduce FAIRR for those who may not be as familiar with us. We are a global investor network. We focus on addressing and assessing the ESG risks, as well as the opportunities in the animal protein industry. So we support asset owners and asset managers by providing the knowledge, the research and data throughout the investment decision-making and the investment holding process, as well as supporting them with their stewardship activities. And this slide really is just to show how our investment network is pretty global, just as the issues and the companies that we're covering and the themes that we focus on are global in nature. It's certainly not something that, when it comes to these ESG risks and AMR in particular, that stops at borders. And so therefore it does need that global coordinated approach as well. So on the next slide, it just shows how when it comes to supporting our investors, it means that we're helping when it comes to defining some of those material risks that exist in this sector, whether that's looking at working conditions or biodiversity and deforestation, the climate impacts of the animal agriculture industry, and or antibiotics usage and AMR, as we're here to talk about today. And we also analyze and engage with companies all along the value chain from farm to fork. And we have now gone one step before that, looking at the pharmaceutical companies, given that animal agriculture is such a significant consumer of pharmaceutical products, as it was said before, consuming more than 80% of all antibiotics in the US and comfortably over half to 3/4 of antibiotics sold globally. And so in our view, if we are to address some of the most material ESG risks facing us today, we need to galvanize the investment community to analyze and engage with our food system, as well as engaging with the food system all along the supply chain. So in order to do that, FAIRR provides a range of research and tools on our website to really drill into these issues, whether that's looking at policy, alternative proteins, or antibiotics and collaborative engagements to really harness the power of the investor voice. We want to make sure that investors have access to the research and the tools that they need really, and the resources they need to understand the risk in their portfolios and to take action as it relates to the food system. So on the next slide, I won't spend too long in this because we have already heard about the human and economic cost of AMR. So I don't want to spend time reiterating. So if you move to the next slide. So I don't want to spend too long in terms of reiterating the figures, but I do think it's important to really stress the economic cost that AMR is estimated to bring. So that's about $35 billion in the US already, and it costs the global economy $100 trillion by 2050. And we are seeing governments, and it's really moving up when it comes to the global agenda. So on the global stage, we've had the G7, both the health and importantly, the finance ministers recognizing that AMR is a global health and economic threat. And last year, they committed to working together to curb the silent pandemic of antimicrobial resistance. And this silent pandemic is largely due to the inappropriate use as well as the overuse of antimicrobials in humans, but significantly in the animals as well. And AMR, the antimicrobial resistant bacteria originating in animals, can be transmitted to humans, as Anthony said, through the environment, through food products or direct contact. And it means that the antibiotic stewardship in food supply chains is an absolute necessity as well as an urgent human health issue. So I just want to spend a little bit of time discussing the impact of animal agriculture and the animal pharmaceutical industries have when it comes to increasing that risk of AMR, and the roles that investors as well as companies and policymakers can actually have in supporting the industry to mitigate some of those riskier practices that increase that AMR risk. So on the next slide, it shows that the reason why there's such large amounts of antibiotics used in animal agriculture is largely because of the intensive nature which the animal agriculture industry has evolved into over time. We have crowded, unsanitary conditions where animals are packed together to try and increase the efficiency or sweat the assets that the farmers have. But it means that there's a lot of stress on these animals, which impacts their immune system, makes them weaker. And that makes it much easier for illnesses to occur and pathogens to breed, and so therefore antibiotics are then used. There's an additional benefit, which is that when fed to animals, some antibiotics can actually promote growth. So you run the risk of farmers giving antibiotics to animals to improve weight gain and therefore try and boost the yield that they gain from the animals on that front. And so therefore, of course, not really a responsible use of antibiotics. And the usage in this industry impacts the environment, as we see up to 80% of the antibiotics that are consumed actually being excreted by the animal and ends up polluting the environment in terms of wastewater and manure. And so that spreads that risk of AMR into the wider communities and the environments around them as well. And AMR impacts so many aspects of society, healthcare and insurance provisions, for example, or general human and economic activity. But despite the magnitude of the threat that AMR poses, the risks are not being fully addressed or priced into investment decisions or actions that are taken today to reduce that risk. And so at this juncture, I just want to briefly talk about that link between animal welfare and AMR that I had mentioned before. So when you have poor welfare practices being implemented, as I said, the animals being packed closely together in these high stress environments, it does lead to the weakened immune systems, as well as the increased chance of disease outbreaks, as I mentioned before. And so these factors boost the risk of superbugs. So therefore, to fight AMR and the economic risk that it poses, we believe that investors must push for higher animal welfare standards as well. It makes ethical as well as, very importantly, economic sense to do so. And on the next slide, please, it shows how FAIRR has been looking at this issue alongside other leading bodies and encouraging that One Health approach to antimicrobial stewardship, because, as I said, AMR is an issue that needs a coordinated response. We cannot think of addressing it from only the human health or the animal health or the environmental health aspects. We need to make sure we're looking after all aspects of health in the ecosystem. And similarly, in terms of how it is that we do that, we need to ensure that all stakeholders in all aspects of society involved, from consumers to corporates, from regulators to investors, we all have a part to play in ensuring that we're starting to decrease the total use and really promote the responsible use of antibiotics. So we need to really start thinking about what alternatives there are, how it is that we can ensure that antibiotic use is being reduced, particularly in the livestock industry, which accounts for such a significant proportion of global antibiotics use today. The next slide shows that there are some green shoots of hope when it comes to reduction of antibiotic usage. Over the last decade, there has been a reduction observed globally, and this can be attributed to regulation, particularly bans on antibiotic growth promoters, as well as shifting consumer preferences for animal proteins produced using fewer or even no antibiotics ever. Most notably, that trend is really seen in the US at the moment. And these reductions are encouraging, definitely, and show that it's possible to raise animals successfully without the routine use of antibiotics if farming methods are altered and adapted in order to make that possible. And this chart shows how sales of antibiotics have been decreasing over the past 10 years for the US, Europe, and the UK. Although I should point out, of course, that the European data for 2019 still isn't actually available as yet. But still, in the US, antibiotic use has decreased 26% since its peak, between its peaks in 2015 to 2019. And in Europe, it's reduced by about 28% since 2014, and by half, by 50% in the UK since 2012. And it's interesting to note that in the UK, reductions of antibiotics have actually been largely voluntary and have been achieved through effective stakeholder collaboration between vets, farmers, the government, and organizations such as the National Farmers Union. So multi-stakeholder engagement really does work. While reductions are being seen in some markets, greater reductions are still needed. And in fact, the data shows that antibiotic usage in the US actually increased from 2017 to 2018. And as Anthony mentioned, antibiotics usage in emerging markets also have an impact on global AMR risk. And yet the combination of the increasing industrialization of animal agriculture in these regions, combined with the lack of regulation restricting the use of antibiotics, means usage is actually expected to increase. We still don't get adequate disclosure from some of the fast-growing lower middle-income countries. So for example, Brazil and India don't publicly report data on antimicrobial usage at all, and China doesn't actually report annually as yet. And so that means that reporting is lacking in the countries with the fastest growing animal agriculture industries. So again, we all need to engage to encourage better disclosure in this regard from corporates and from regulators, especially given that this is a global problem that doesn't stop at borders. Now, if we move to the next slide, just say that I've talked a bit about the use of antibiotics, but what about the suppliers of antibiotics? So at FAIRR, we published a report last year that examines the animal health industry through an AMR lens. We wanted to really help investors to integrate AMR into their investment decisions when looking at the animal pharmaceutical companies in particular. And through this work, we've investigated the role that these companies can play in addressing AMR, and also what current practices and policies exist within the industry. And this has really informed our framework for what best practice antimicrobial stewardship can be used, or can be, and how to apply that and use that when it comes to assessing company performance. And while there has been investor attention and action focused on the protein producers, the food retailers, the manufacturers, as well as restaurant companies as well, to drive down antibiotic usage in animal agriculture, the animal health industry is the first step in the supply chain for antibiotics, yet it really hasn't received that much, or as much attention, I should say, from investors. And we believe this will change, and we're actually driving that process by having more attention brought to bear on these companies through collaborative investor engagements and encouraging increased transparency and disclosure there. And on the next slide, wanting to highlight that when it comes to assessing what best practice antimicrobial stewardship looks like, we believe 4 key areas need to be addressed when it comes to animal pharma companies. It means that we want to examine manufacturing practices and see what regulatory standards are being upheld. So for example, is wastewater being treated? What efforts are being made to limit the AMR risk to the employees and local communities around these factories? It also means taking a proactive role in how drugs are marketed, labeled, and packaged, going beyond just meeting local regulatory requirements, but also taking into account how current practices contribute to AMR. Is the company investing in R&D into alternatives to antibiotics, for example? And does the company actually acknowledge the role that it has in addressing AMR and adopting a One Health approach? For animal health companies, for animal pharmaceutical companies, this means greater oversight across their global supply chains to ensure that its own stewardship efforts aren't actually being undermined by other company actions elsewhere in its supply chain. It also means recognizing lobbying activities can also undermine stewardship activities. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to say it's worth pointing out that evidence suggests that lobbying efforts by the animal pharmaceutical companies, both directly and indirectly through industry bodies representing them, runs contradictory to AMR stewardship efforts sometimes. So in 2019, animal health companies and organizations spent more than just over $3 million lobbying in the US and Europe on issues including tax, trade, AMR, and agriculture. And although there's a lack of transparency on what exactly these lobbying activities support, if the animal pharmaceutical companies are similar to other industries like the oil and gas industry or the meat and dairy industry, they will tend to lobby in favor of less stringent regulation, unfortunately. So despite publicly championing AMR stewardship efforts, leading animal pharmaceutical companies appear to be devoting resources to lobbying against bills aimed at safeguarding AMR for human medicine in order to have it, they continue to use them in animals. So really what we call for here is transparency and disclosure. Disclosure by these animal health companies of how their lobbying aligns with their stewardship efforts on AMR would be very, very much welcomed by us and the broader investment community. The next slide, I just wanted to touch on two things when it comes to regulation and policy. First, the European ban, which came into effect earlier this year in January on the prophylactic use of antimicrobials for animal agriculture, is really a milestone in terms of regulation and reduction of antibiotic use in animals. It includes new powers to allow the European Parliament to completely exclude certain last resort antibiotics used in human medicine from being used in farming. And it's really an important step, as there's often very little difference, a very fine line between the dosage used for growth promotion and prophylaxis, meaning that the restriction of use for growth promotion may have little impact on the volume of antibiotics used if the prophylactic use of antibiotics is not also being considered and banned. And given the volumes of antibiotics used in animals, the passing of this legislation is something that would be really encouraging to see other countries develop and enforce as well. And secondly, one to watch is the EU taxonomy, when investors have been very vocal in feedback on the taxonomy's aim to establish an EU-wide classification framework to provide the companies and investors with that common language to identify which economic activities are actually environmentally sustainable. And towards the end of last year, there was an investor letter that was supported by over $3 trillion in assets. I think it was about $3.5 trillion in assets, that called on the EU to ensure the taxonomy is as robust as possible when it comes to agriculture. And particularly that letter stated that antibiotic usage should be covered in the do no significant harm criteria. Now, after this disagreements amongst multiple stakeholders, the decision for agriculture has been delayed. And unfortunately, there hasn't yet been a release or update to that we have been able to see. But it's still something to watch with regards to agriculture and antibiotics. And within FAIRR, myself and my colleagues will be following this with interest. Now, finally, on the next slide, I just want to say that I have talked about AMR, the risk it presents to human, animal, and environmental health, the role animal agriculture plays, and the role of the animal pharmaceutical companies in particular, as well as a little on recent EU regulation. So the last thing I'd like to mention is a specific initiative that investors can utilize, both in terms of deepening their understanding, but also increasing their impact when it comes to reducing the incidence of AMR. And the Invest Action on AMR was launched in 2020, and it's a collaboration with the PRI, the UK Department of Health, the Access to Medicine Foundation, and us, FAIRR Initiative. And it's a great example of that One Health approach being used to bridge the gap with policy, investor, and research worlds, and using a diverse global coalition to avoid acting in silos and really coordinate cross-border action that we need to see. It has a range of investors involved, all performing different actions to address AMR. We welcome new participants, so do get in touch to find out more. And in fact, one of the members of the initiative, Alice Evans from Columbia Threadneedle Investments, will be discussing her work in a moment. But just to serve as inspiration or a jumping off point, some examples of some of the way that investors in this coalition are driving change are that they have been engaging with protein producers and restaurant brands, encouraging robust antibiotic policies, or to make time-bound commitments on antibiotic usage. There have been multiple shareholder proposals being filed to improve antibiotic policies at some of the largest food retailers, such as McDonald's and Yum Brands. And some of the investors have been developing a step-by-step guide on how investors can adopt that AMR lens and integrate AMR risk into ESG analysis. And as I mentioned before, we saw reference to AMR in the G7 finance minister statements at the end of last year. And they've actually specifically welcomed efforts by the Invest Action on AMR to better assess and mitigate AMR risk and impacts in their investments and financing strategies. And they committed to taking specific actions to address antibiotic market failures. So investor voices do play an important role in achieving the recognition of AMR as a material financial risk, ensuring that AMR is looked at as more than only a public health issue at a policy level, but also that finance economic issue as well. And investors continue to have a role to play when it comes to encouraging better AMR stewardship from companies, from policymakers, and from investors themselves. So the final slide is just, let's say, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this really esteemed panel. I'll pass it back to you here, Sarah.
Thank you, and thank you for making the case for business risk of AMR. I think it's very clear, and also clear what investors can do collectively. So now I'd like to invite Alice. Let's see. Yeah, Alice, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, this is really a perfect segue. So my name's Alice Evans. I am part of Columbia Threadneedle Investments. You might know us previously as BMO Global Asset Management. The EMEA part of that business was sold to Columbia Threadneedle. And so for those who have been familiar with some of the work that we do in responsible investment, that was our previous brand, but we've just joined Columbia Threadneedle and are really excited that, you know, a much bigger asset manager now has brought us with full support for our responsible investment approach and our program here. So yeah, exciting to see where this takes us next. But I think, oh, sorry, maybe next slide. Thanks. Thanks. So our approach to AMR as a topic comes into our sort of broader approach to shareholder stewardship. We engage very actively on our own assets, but we also run a service of stewardship, engagement and voting for third parties as well. So we pool investor voice to hone in on particular topics of importance to wider investors. I think Teni has done a really good job of making the case for why AMR does pose material business risk. So I won't spend too long on this. I think for us as shareholders, you know, there are multiple reasons why risk is incurred in individual companies exposed to the issue, but more broadly, you know, AMR being out of control presents such a material public health risk that if you think of us as kind of universal investors, there is systemic risk to our entire portfolio and kind of financial security by not addressing this topic. And so for us, it's key. Next slide, please. So how we approach this, you know, kind of at the coalface, I'd say first of all, we have relied very heavily on the amazing work of the FAIRR initiative and also the Access to Medicine Foundation in doing great background research to understand the approaches of the different companies and kind of the scale of the problem, and we've been leveraging that. And we have been working individually and collaboratively with other investors to implement this engagement approach. The way that we've looked at it is very much taking, as Teni says, the One Health approach, that we have to look across sectors and reinforce the same message with different parts of the kind of the ecosystem. And so we targeted, on the one hand, pharmaceutical companies. I know this webinar is really focused on the animal and agriculture aspect, but I think the pharmaceutical industry is also a very important piece of the picture here, obviously. And with the pharma companies, we have been pressing on the approach to R&D in developing new antimicrobial agents, very much on responsible manufacturing, and it's fairly under control in countries like the UK, but where a lot of the pharmaceutical manufacturing takes place, for instance, in India, we hear that there are rivers with the level of antibiotics equivalent to a treated patient, you know, such as the level of discharge from some of the sort of less well-controlled manufacturing facilities. And then finally, we've been engaging them on appropriate stewardship of existing agents. And then we've taken that approach through to animal health, which I think has been a particularly important development, because pharmaceutical companies are very aware of AMR as an issue. They're very active on the topic, and there's been a lot of progress there. And they're also very used to engaging with investors in discussing it. think animal health, it's been a little bit more difficult to get traction with those companies, but with such a high proportion of antibiotic use being in animal health, this is absolutely crucial to making progress on the issue. And so we've, I'll say more about that in due course. And then obviously there's the other side of the equation, the users of antibiotics in the food industry. And we've been engaging both food producers, the large protein producers, a lot of that is in the US, and also moving up the value chain to restaurants and supermarkets, holding them to account on their suppliers. And that's where you can have kind of reputational leverage come in a little bit more. And so there we've been engaging very precisely on antibiotic policy and disclosure, on animal welfare, and again, specific disclosure and tracking of targets, and also around routine antibiotic use, to push it back from growth promotion, shouldn't be used at all, used prophylactically for disease prevention, we need to reduce that, and then finally sort of target in just on using more in a much more targeted way for disease treatment. And then we've been pushing that with all of the food producers and restaurant chains that we've been engaging. Next slide, please. So where have we got to with this? We engaged nearly 50 companies over 3 years on these topics. A lot of were initial conversations, sort of laying out the agenda, raising awareness, and then checking back in to continue to push for the engagement objectives that we've been after. I think there has been a lot of traction in the pharma sector. And a really significant move there was the launch of the AMR Action Fund, which sort of brings together more than 20 pharmaceutical companies, the WHO, the Wellcome Trust, and the European Investment Bank, to have sort of a pooled risk fund. And we need to change the economic models behind around antibiotics, which have been challenging and have not offered the right incentives for new agents to be produced. With the food sector, both agriculture and the restaurant industry, there has been recognition of the issue. It is there. There have been there's been increasing sort of promises of transparency, piecemeal target setting. It has been slow, and it's tended to start with starting to get to grips with the very real difficulty of understanding whole supply chains and of analyzing impact of antibiotic use. And it's very, very gradual. And unfortunately, COVID-19 further slowed that progress, and I think provided a pretty problematic distraction from the issue, even as it demonstrated very clearly the systemic risk of global health pandemics. And so, as Teni shared some of the data on here, we have seen a reduction in antibiotic use, at least the 27% between 2016 and 2018. We are still waiting for data even from 2019, so we're flying blind a little bit. But there has also been push forward in regulation, and there has been progress from the companies that we've engaged with, at least some of them, on tackling the issue. So Yum Brands is an example. They own KFC, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell. They piloted kind of a regular assessment of the impact of their suppliers' husbandry practices on antimicrobial use in poultry. It was a relatively limited pilot, but they did achieve a 50% reduction in the use of antimicrobials in 2 European markets as a result of kind of third-party auditing and consulting. So if you target it, it can make a difference. Next slide. Oh, a big example here is McDonald's. They're a company that we have engaged consistently over the past 2 or 3 years. And they're a very important leader in tackling antimicrobial resistance. They have their market position makes them very influential, And so what they demand of their suppliers and what they have to work hard to put tracking and systems and expectations in place. But if they're successful at doing that, it's likely to influence the industry really positively. And so, they first developed a position on responsible antibiotic use in 2003, which I think was very early. And then in 2015, they launched a whole vision for antimicrobial stewardship, which laid out a roadmap that they were going to follow. And this was a really leading piece of work, and led to, in 2018, a huge step for this industry in announcing an antibiotics policy on beef applicable to their top 10 beef sourcing markets, which is more than 85% of their global beef supply. But unfortunately, they have been distracted from making progress on their targets, and have not in the end delivered against their goal to report this year against antibiotic reduction targets. And I think they've been, again, pretty distracted by COVID-19, and were subject this year to a shareholder proposal kind of forcing them to return to their goals on antibiotic reduction, and to refocus on the mission. So I think it illustrates some of the levers that you can and have to pull as investors. We can collaborate with other investors, we can collaborate with other stakeholders, we can engage, we can use the kind of power of the shareholder voice to have that conversation, and ultimately we can use the power of the vote to reinforce that action. Next slide, please. Given the focus of this webinar, I won't dwell on this, but there's been a lot of progress in the pharmaceutical industry. Glaxo are an example of best practice here on stewardship. And I think one thing to highlight that they do is they have a survey on antibiotic stewardship where they collect and identify the pathogens causing the most common community-acquired respiratory tract infections, and test them against a wide range of antibiotics. And then the data from that is shared with public health stakeholders, healthcare professionals, in marketing materials, to really be part of the community of sharing knowledge on the evolution of AMR, to help with the stewardship of that. Then moving on. So what are we doing? This is what our program looks like now. The original targets of protein producers, restaurants, and pharma, we are continuing a kind of a maintenance level of engagement there, continuing to make the same encouragement to disclose, to then set targets against the disclosure, and to be ambitious in maintaining that pressure on addressing antibiotic usage. Then we launched a kind of exploratory engagement program into adjacent industries, sort of looking on the healthcare side at diagnostics companies, looking for what more they can do to help reduce antibiotic usage by being more targeted in tests for disease. And then we've also been working with water utilities on where they sit in the ecosystem, on purifying wastewater and monitoring discharge. I think those are still pretty exploratory conversations. Diagnostic companies are prioritizing this issue, and I'm not sure there's much more investors can do to push that. Water utility companies, this is a very peripheral issue, and I think there's more that we can do to raise awareness there. And then the big focus for this year, very much as outlined by Teni, we are part of the collaboration with FAIRR and other investors on the animal health companies. As I said, they're not very used to being engaged by investors. They haven't been responsive, but they are absolutely in the crosshairs of where we need to make progress. And so that's the big push on the investor side this year. Then finally, next slide, please. And it's not just about individual company engagement and using the vote. I think as investors, we can also be part of wider collaborations, raising awareness generally. We supported a letter to the G7 requesting focus on this issue as a key priority, and we're delighted when Germany announced that during their leadership of the G7, this would be one of their top 5 priority topics. We've been part of the Investor Year of Action on AMR and tried to raise awareness across the market through various channels, conferences, media interviews, sharing our research. We launched a podcast with Dame Sally Davis, also raising awareness on this topic. And yet this is exactly the kind of webinar that we're delighted to contribute to, because I think it's an issue that has gained traction. We've seen progress. There's a coherence around how we tackle it, but it's still a relatively fringe issue as far as like the broader investment community is concerned, and it absolutely deserves to move further up the agenda. I think that's, yeah, questions, in due course questions, thanks.
Thank you very much, Alice. Very interesting to see what you are doing as an investor. Lots of activities. Just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat box and we'll get to them during the Q&A. So now for the final presentation, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. You can go on to the next slide. So I'm Jennifer Black. I'm the head of the FAIRR Finance campaign at World Animal Protection, based here in The Hague. Next slide. For those of you who don't know who World Animal Protection are, we're a global animal protection NGO. We were founded in 1950 and we have offices all around the world. And basically our mission is to move the world to protect animals, both animals in the food system and wildlife. But obviously today we're focusing on the food system side of things. You can go on to the next slide. So I think the other speakers have really made it really clear that AMR is a really serious issue and it does need action from governments and companies and other stakeholders to be tackled effectively. But as World Animal Protection, we really do believe that from the perspective of investors, focusing on the overuse of antibiotics in industrial livestock is one of the most meaningful contributions that you can make. And if we go on to the next slide, I won't dwell on this too long because I know that several of the points have been touched upon by the other speakers in their really excellent presentations. But I do just really want to go back to just how inextricably linked animal welfare and antimicrobial resistance are. So Teni mentioned that animals in factory farming systems, they experience a lot of mental and physical stress that would normally kind of make them prone to disease. And what we're talking about there is, for instance, a lot of animals are routinely mutilated. So they will have their tails cut or their teeth clipped or their beaks trimmed and other things like this that generally happen to alleviate behavioral problems that result from animals being stressed. So if you have a stressed pig, it's more likely that that pig is going to chew on another pig's tail, which then increases the risk of like infections and other problems. But at the moment, rather than giving the pigs the space and enrichment that they need to stay mentally stimulated, the current solution is kind of to remove their tails and give them antibiotics. And as well as that, intensive systems tend to have high stocking densities and genetically similar breeds, which means that you have thousands of genetically identical or very, very similar animals with low resilience in a small space together. And to paper over these kind of inherent flaws, entire herds of animals are being routinely given preventative antibiotics. So they're being given antibiotics even when they don't have signs of disease, basically just to prop up low welfare farming methods. And something that we often talk about is thinking about really what that means. Like if you or I were living in really unhealthy conditions and every morning after having a kind of cup of coffee, you have to take antibiotics just to stop yourself getting sick, we would really consider that something is wrong and broken in the way that we're living. But that is essentially the reality for billions of animals, like at the moment. And as Anthony and Temi's slides have both illustrated, once resistant bacteria emerge from these systems, there are lots of ways for the bacteria to then transfer between the farm and into our environments and communities. So it's not a problem that kind of can be neatly contained in the farm. And if the next slide, we'll just go over very quickly because it just has this kind of impactful quote that summarizes what I was saying about how animal welfare and antibiotic usage are kind of linked. So we'll go on to the next slide, which I will basically just not dwell upon at all, because I think that it's already been mentioned by other speakers. In terms of why we want to focus on livestock, firstly, of course, the fact that 75% of the world's antibiotics are used in farmed animals, of course, means that the sheer scale of the problem there is really huge. And then two additional factors are the projected growth in the livestock sector as sort of meat consumption and production is projected to grow between now and 2050. And of course, the transmission from farms to communities. So this is why investor action on responsible antibiotic use and animal welfare in the food sector would kind of greatly contribute to alleviating the worst effects of AMR. Go on to the next slide. So I know that sometimes as NGOs, we get accused of talking too much about what we don't want and not sort of being clear in what we do want. So I wanted to be really clear on our vision and what change we want investors to be asking for. And luckily, in this case, it's actually fairly simple. So it's no more group prophylactic or preventative use of antibiotics. And as was already mentioned, the EU has already banned group preventative use of antibiotics, which shows that it can be done. It's not a kind of impossible hill to climb. But along with that, we want to see responsible stewardship and the improvement of animal welfare to align with the farm's responsible minimum standard, which I'll explain a bit more in a couple of slides' time. And again, just to say the two elements are really linked. And although there are other ways of, you could just stop using antibiotics overnight without improving animal welfare, but that wouldn't actually be responsible. A lot of the animals would suffer because they would get ill. And you risk also fixing one problem and kind of creating another problem. We know that high stocking densities and stressed animals are a really good breeding ground for zoonotic diseases like swine fever and avian flu and things like this. So it would be kind of dispiriting to put a lot of effort into solving one problem and creating another one. So that's why we really want to see the change on the two levers at the same time. Next slide. So to close, because I do want to make sure that we have time for some questions, I'm just going to talk very briefly about a little bit of our work with the financial sector. Next slide. The first thing that I really want to focus on is the FARNS initiative. And the FARNS initiative was created by World Animal Protection, Compassion in World Farming, and Humane Society International, so three of the world's leading animal protection organizations. And we all basically came together and saw that there was a problem for financial institutions, which was that you have global animal welfare frameworks like the 5 freedoms, but they're very vague. So the 5 freedoms, for instance, says that animals have the right to freedom from discomfort, but it's really hard to know what that actually means. And that means that companies can often claim in their policies that they adhere to these concepts while still, conducting practices that we know are harmful. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have certification schemes, which tend to be at the national level and can be really detailed and specific with like hundreds of pages of really technical guidance that it's almost impossible for investors to understand. So that's why together our 3 organizations have developed the responsible minimum standards. They're based on the animal welfare risks set out in the IFC, the International Finance Corporation's Animal Welfare Good Practice Note. and they give a set of really specific, measurable minimum animal welfare criteria for, I think it's 6 species. It's like meat cattle, dairy cows, layer hens, broiler chickens, pigs, and aquaculture is the new one. And these standards really set out a global minimum standard. So it's not like country specific, it's a global minimum standard for raising, transporting, and slaughtering livestock. And across all species, the group preventative use of antibiotics is not allowed. And because the responsible minimum standards should guarantee a better standard of animal welfare, this antibiotic reduction is kind of responsible rather than potentially leading to more suffering or increasing other risks. But I should mention, of course, that some animals can and will get sick, and like antibiotics can still be used to treat sick animals. Like it's not a blanket no antibiotics kind of policy. So over the last few years, we've been working with Compassion and Humane Society to engage with a lot of different financial institutions and other stakeholders to kind of start sharing the responsible minimum standards as a tool that they can use. And so far, we've had a really good reception. The responsible minimum standards are now referenced in various documents and policies by kind of institutions like ING and Actiam, BNP Paribas, ABN AMRO, the Climate Bonds Initiative, the UNEP Principles for Responsible Banking, and the ESG guidance for insurers. So we're kind of continuing to work to build up the profile of the fund's responsible minimum standards and the kind of credibility as a global fund animal welfare framework that's useful for investors. So just, a shout out here that if anybody is at all interested on that, please do get in contact with me. And if we just go to the next slide, just to finish off, I'll briefly talk about the role of data, because it's something that comes up in a lot of our conversations with financial institutions. And of course, like financials will screen companies based mostly on the information from like data providers or like asset managers or others. And at the moment, there is a lot of information out there on animal welfare, as well as the kind of for antibiotic use. They're not always linked to one another. But the data can be quite scarce or patchy on some topics, or it's often not presented in a kind of consistent way across companies or geographies, which can limit how usable or useful it is. So as the FAIRR initiative, we're currently conducting a research project that will then give a kind of recommended pathway. So we're mapping out existing data on animal welfare. So that's kind of what the companies are disclosing, but it also includes various scorecards and things like that that are prepared by civil society across the animal production and consumption chain, looking at things like the public availability, the cost, the methodology used, how well that data is maintained, the criteria that it covers, like a whole host of things to just really assess what the current state of play is. And then we're going to evaluate different scenarios going forward, like including the possibility of how we can fill data gaps that exist or kind of like help to standardize data that already exists to present it in a way that is more useful and usable. So it's in early stages at the moment, but it is a really high priority for us as an organization and as the FAIRR initiative. So expect to see more news in this space from us kind of coming up. And with that, I will close and thank you for listening and just say, yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and a good discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you, Jenny. Very good to hear that the responsible minimum standards are being picked up. We'll now move on to the Q&A part of this session. So I'd like to call all the speakers to the floor, so to say. So for everyone watching, if you have a question, you can place it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a hand icon. And once you raise your hand, we'll unmute you so you can ask your question. So first question has come in. The question is, with the current EU regulations, which part of the European supply chain requires the most attention at the moment? Is there anyone who would like to say something on this issue? So I'll repeat the question. With the current EU regulations, which part of the European supply chain requires the most attention at the moment?
All right, maybe I could just kick off, although I'm not the European on this panel. So nonetheless, I would say that, we're obviously looking very eagerly at a robust implementation of the efforts to restrict the use of particularly critically important antimicrobials for human medicine in the implementation of the veterinary antimicrobials regulation in Europe. And why is it so important? It's not just important for the continent of Europe. We actually see it, particularly in a civil society perspective, it's really important as a signal to the markets that actually export to the European Union. So for us, it's not only choosing the right antimicrobials to actually make sure that in such enforcement actually restrictions actually applies, including like colistin, a last line antibiotic, which I had mentioned earlier, which is so important actually when all the chips are down and we're still looking for something to treat a patient who otherwise would not survive an infection that's drug resistant. But we also need to make sure that actually there's some ways in which to extend the ripple effects to the supply chains beyond Europe. And that's, I think, what's going to be really important for us to figure out and how to do it well. That requires really also much more transparent trade data. And while the European Union itself does allow country level reporting, like in the World Organization for Animal Health, actually a system, the World Organization for Animal Health itself does not actually make transparent country level data, for example, on which countries still allow the use of antibiotics as growth promoters. That country level data is not available. So it's very difficult for actually, I'm sure all the people around the table here are working on this, as well as, of course, civil society groups, to act on it when we don't have that kind of transparency. And so we need to also work with the various actors that can be motivated by this group to actually get governments to tell, actually to make their data transparent, and also tell the World Organization for Animal Health how important this is to make it transparent at a global level, so we can have country level actionable data.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, Anthony. Is there anyone who would like to add on to Anthony's comments? No, okay, then
I say, I think that's a great point. I would say for the question, like, it's not so much a case of, where are we pushing given the EU regulation, which part of the value chain. It's, that's already at the forefront. Companies will have to comply with regulation. It's what's the hinterland that we need to push to have companies in all parts of the value chain ahead of what will be quite difficult regulation to comply with in other parts of the world. And I think I would also just add here, I don't think it's about which part of the chain needs most work, because it's a whole ecosystem, and that's why we're approaching every part of the chain kind of simultaneously. Everybody has to move together for this to be effective, because you can't, no one part of the chain can implement this on their own.
Yep. Let me just quickly check if there are any questions in the chat box or any hands. Maybe in the meantime, do any of the speakers have questions for each other?
I actually had a question for Jenny and Teni, because Jenny, your work is extremely useful. I think this is great, and look forward to digging into more of what you're doing. I was wondering if you've already been collaborating with FAIRR or ATMI on some of the kind of data collection and metrics, and it's very, very useful for us in the investor sector to rely on that kind of data and benchmarking. Yeah, thanks, and a question.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been working with FAIRR for a while now, quite closely, and the project has just kicked off, but I can certainly promise Teni that you're basically going to be our first port of call in terms of who we're contacting to talk about this. So yeah, absolutely. We don't want to be reinventing the wheel, and we know that FAIRR has a huge amount of expertise and knowledge already in the area. So we look forward to kind of continuing to work quite closely.
Yes, indeed. And I think it shows the the value in terms of collaboration. So between NGOs and stakeholders and initiatives, and also with investors as well. So making sure that we are all, as much as possible, knowledge sharing where we can, and making sure that we are therefore all kind of pulling in the same direction. So yes, we do work with Jenny and her team, and definitely looking forward to continuing that collaboration.
Great to hear.
Any other questions, either from the audience or the speakers?
I might have one from our colleagues in the investor community, and perhaps it's the opportunity for having more dialogue between the investor community and those in civil society and the academy in this area. But we oftentimes find policy tensions emerging in some of these efforts taken on by industry. For example, just to name like three, the AMR Action Fund, in many ways supplanted a World Health Organization European Investment Bank initiative to create a public investment fund that might have had much more strong access and stewardship conditions and requirements. So they are picking up, of course, the last mile of antibiotic candidates for clinical testing, putting them actually, of course, with the last mile with some support from industry to bring it the last mile. But we are, of course, want to make sure they're affordable for consumers and that they're properly stewarded. And that would have been better done under, of course, a public sector infrastructure. But this platform has been used also to call for higher reimbursement, which makes it less affordable for the antibiotics of those in need, actually in human medicine, well, across the world, but especially in low and middle income countries. So that's one policy tension, I guess, to think about, and how we actually deal with that in these kind of discussions is important. A second would be, again, the surveillance data. When industry collects surveillance data, it comes from sometimes the capital, leading hospitals that use the most antibiotics. So not surprising, they might have higher drug resistance rates. And that can lead to misleading information at the country level as to how national guidelines are set, so that we don't prematurely sunset actually first-line antibiotics and move to second-line antibiotics that might be more expensive. They might be newer. They might be actually the drugs of these companies that are funding the surveillance systems. But unfortunately, they may not be the ones we actually are prepared or should be moving in the community actually throughout the country. And so we have to, again, be vigilant on that. And the third tension, of course, has been about manufacturing discharge of pollution. How do we actually ensure that, in fact, the fragility of access to affordable antibiotics is protected as well, while we try to work out how the environmental discharges should be managed? Can we figure out ways in which to do this so it's not just simply larger multinational companies trying to push out, active pharmaceutical ingredient producers in China and India because it's to their competitive advantage to do so? So I think these kinds of tensions are really challenging. And I'm just wondering how the investor community, when it talks about these issues, navigates this. And maybe there's a way and a role for actually civil society and the academy to help out in these kinds of discussions. But we'd love to hear your reflections.
Just jump in really quickly, say, Anthony, all completely valid. And if we could answer those questions and really address those tensions, and we would solve the significant amount of the problems really that comes from AMR, and in fact applying it to other environmental risks that we're facing as well. I think that it's completely, just thinking of the last point first in terms of the manufacturing side of things. And this is a tension that appears in other areas as well. So when you're, say, looking at deforestation or farming, and you want to reduce the intensification of animal agriculture and the knock-on impact it has on the actual people on the ground, the farmers and their livelihoods and the communities that rely on them as well, that it isn't a case of you'll have one solution that perfectly matches and ticks everything. There does need to be that conversation, and I guess you pull that into the just transition. And when we think about climate risk and trying to mitigate and reduce emissions, and making sure that it's not that people are then being managed out of a job without being reskilled or upskilled into something else. So yes, there's definitely the need when it comes to thinking about these issues to make sure that we don't end up having these higher level boardroom level conversation discussions about, well, this must change, X, Y, and Z must change, but that we are really engaging with the people on the ground who are at the coalface, so to speak. So I don't know what the answer is, the solution is, other than to say that it does need people coming around the table to discuss this and to make sure that we are hearing from those who can come up with innovative ideas of what is really practical, what possible solutions could there actually be. So the way we work at FAIRR is that we do want to make sure that we don't go in with our idea of how things must change. We want a transition. We want a sustainable transition to a more sustainable way of more sustainable production methods. But there's no one right answer in terms of what that looks like. It will be different in different regions, depending on the natural resources that exist in the area. But what we can say for sure is that the way things are operating today cannot be where we stop and where we end up. Because even if you say, well, nearer term, there is the employment or the income for the regions, for the local communities. Longer term, that's not going to remain the case. That's not going to be the case because of how they are not managing effectively and the resources that they actually have. So I've gone on a bit of a stream of consciousness there, but just say that, yes, when it comes to these kind of issues, yes, we do need to make sure that we are speaking to everybody involved and not trying to on high decide what works best for them without actually including them in conversation as well.
I'll just add to that, so I know we're basically out of time, but taking the first of your examples of tensions, I think we have to recognize we are absolutely dependent on the expertise, the capital. We depend on the pharmaceutical industry really to bring new agents to the market. Like, this isn't going to something that's going to only come from governments and academia. So everyone needs to be around the table there. And I think the reason we haven't got a strong pipeline of new agents is that antibiotics are different than other types of drugs. You actually don't want to use them. You need to keep them on the shelf. And so it costs a company $1 billion to bring something to the market, and then ideally it will never be used. And so the model that you're used to in the pharma sector just simply doesn't work in antibiotics. And so we need to find other ways of resolving this. And this is where I think these initiatives that have taken place, bringing together the pharma sector with multinational agencies, with other stakeholders in civil society, that it's really essential. You have to have some kind of risk and reward sharing here, and that's what's trying to take place. But I think, and your point on you're putting up costs and will that affect access and so on, I think the cost can't flow through to the consumer. The cost has to be somehow tackled by these other economic models around the new drugs. But for us as investors, in the conversations that we have with pharma companies, access strategies for every single product coming to the market being in place up front is very much part of our conversation. Just to reassure you there. But these tensions are not easily solved. I agree with you.
Yeah, no, I think the traditional business model probably won't work here. And so it's really important to have probably conversations with non-traditional actually actors in these spaces to bring forward new models. We're seeing that in the United States, CivicRx, an amazing actually sort of alternative type of approach where in fact it's a nonprofit generic company owned, and the members are in fact the hospital systems and foundations in the country. A third of the hospital beds in the United States actually, and they bring as a nonprofit generic company, and the first 2 drugs they brought to market were daptomycin and vancomycin, 2 antibiotics. And so I guess we're going to need to find ways in which the demand side also, in this case, is vertically integrated with the supply side in a way that can better align, in fact, of course, supply and demand, so that we aren't overusing and we're actually producing to the level of use, but not to excess. So I think we're going to have to look for new approaches, and I hope that conversation will be a great way to actually, again, involve a broader set of stakeholders with investor community, and not just between investor communities and the pharmaceutical companies, because I think you'll find the models probably outside of just the traditional multinational companies, and pursuing hopefully an alternative pathway that will lead to the sustainable future you're all looking for.
Exactly, yeah. You need a lot of different perspectives at the table, as Teni said. Completely agreed.
I'm afraid we're almost out of time, but I did see a raised hand, and the person who raised their hand, your microphone is unmuted. So if you'd still like to ask your question, please feel free to do so.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Question to Anthony. Gerard Wijk here from Profunda. Your sources forecast an explosion in costs related to antimicrobial biological and towards 2050. And we know that this part is due to the increased meat consumption. But there are also reports which show that that there will be a big decline in meat consumption after 2030. So do these exploding estimates, do they take into account the expected high growth of cultured meat and meat alternatives? That is my question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. The typical source that's cited is Thomas von Boekel's analysis, which you may be familiar with, and he did it originally actually in an analysis that actually was for the OECD, and then also was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and he updated it again, I believe, in 2019. I believe there are concerns that, particularly since the World Organization for Animal Health data on consumption by country is not actually transparent, we actually do not necessarily have the best way of projecting, because we hear that actually that some of the countries, obviously there's the kinds of trends that you're talking about that may actually run in the opposite direction, but it's very difficult, of course, to do these kinds of actually projections decades out. So I think that you have to go closely to look at the underlying methodology to assess whether or not you feel that they've adequately taken into account other trends and whether or not your estimates actually for alternatives actually are really going to take place. The same thing goes to with the World Bank's estimates, which again are a pretty complicated set of methodologies. Only part, obviously, of the economic costs relate to the food system side. Much of it, of course, is in the human side. So again, you know, I'm not entirely sure in unpacking that whether you'll find this to be a key lever of sensitivity in their analyses or not, but you'd have to dive deeper and probably rerun the analyses based on, again, assumptions that you would be comfortable with. And both of those groups, though, are obviously, I think, excellent ones to approach for that. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's all we have time for today. I know it takes some time to reflect on all the information you've received. So if you have any remaining questions for the speakers at a later date, please send them to me and I'll make sure that they get to the person in question. One more thing before you leave. If you're an institutional investor, and we would greatly appreciate it if you could fill out a short survey on AMR. I've just posted the link in the chat box. The estimated completion time is 3 minutes, and it would help us out a lot if you could do this. A very big thank you to our speakers. This was an amazing panel and amazing speaker presentations. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for sharing your insights, and many thanks to you, the viewers, as well, for your attention and questions. And we hope to welcome you again at future events. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.